Good evening. The light of the sunset defies all possible human engineering and technical skill. It travels all the way to our planet, across the vastness of space. And you expect me to believe that it wasn't invented by ancient aliens? How else could the sun possibly do that? And every single day, no less. What? Are you going to tell me that it's just so massive and dense that its own gravity is actually capable of fusing unimaginable numbers of hydrogen atoms into helium, and then fusing helium atoms into even heavier elements? And that this nuclear fusion emits vast amounts of radiation, and this process just keeps going without stopping for billions of years? Look, I'm not saying it's aliens, but I am saying it's saucer aliens. Because I have no imagination. Ergo, it's saucer aliens. And these are all the facts. Do butterflies ever get abducted to strange realms? Abducted by the wind? And I would really like to get more reports of figures in luminous rectangles on this show, please. Plus, is ATIP even so? Like, what was ATIP again? Pretty sure ATIP's not a thing or whatever. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
Jeff Knox.
Luis Cayetano.
Welcome to Ufo Sunset.
Hello, hello.
Do you have anything to say for yourself, Luis?
Not really. I mean, I'm pretty proud.
Okay. All right, on with the show.
All right.
And now for the ultra rebrief. And now for the ultra rebrief. So wait, there weren't skinwalkers at the Pentagon? Today, Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos and our own Luis Cayetano published a new extensive piece on the history of the former AWSAP, the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, also known by the quote-unquote nickname ATIP. The 74-page study is called On the AWSAP-ATIP Confusion. A link can be found in the episode description, and the study was published for free on academia.edu. The report discusses how a small group of wealthy businessmen, pseudoscientists, and promoters manipulated the US Department of Defense in order to promote pseudoscientific topics within the government. These individuals were associated with Skinwalker Ranch and the former public project to investigate supposed paranormal activity there, the National Institute for Discovery Science. In this new study, the authors used as their central source the 2021 book Skinwalkers at the Pentagon by Dr. James Lakatsky, Colm Kelleher, and George Knapp. The study includes a chronology of UAP study and UAP disclosure in the US government, a detailed historical report on AWSAP, as well as a report of events that transpired in the wake of this program, such as the formation of the UAP Task Force and the more recent formation of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO. The authors give a brief overview of supposed UAP studies in the US after 2017 in the context of broader UFO history, outlining a variety of different balloon, airship, and aerial phantom reports from the late 1700s through to the era of flying saucers. They discuss how different alleged UFO sightings are caused by many different physical stimuli, and how many are misinterpretations motivated by cultural anxieties and preconceptions of the time. And they also make suggestions for how a study like AARO may be more successful. Esther Olmos has been studying UFO reports since 1966, and we have discussed his work previously on this program. He is the founder of PhotoCat, an online catalog of thousands of UFO sighting reports, and he is the co-editor of the 2023 work, The Reliability of UFO Witness Testimony, with Richard W. Hayden. Luis is, of course, one of the hosts of our show. He holds a PhD and is affiliated with Gavilan College currently. He has a background in evolutionary ecology, but he was also a host on the Invisible Night School, and he's done various interviews with scholars and experts and written about issues surrounding the UFO topic, especially as it relates to far-right and extremist socio-political movements. Bear with me here, I'm experiencing some technical issues. A former executive director of MUFON was found guilty of soliciting a minor. Jan Harzan, the former director of the Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, was found guilty by a jury on Thursday for 2 counts: contacting a minor with an intent to commit specified offense and meeting a minor to commit lewd conduct. MUFON is a US-based nonprofit organization whose stated purpose is to investigate UFOs. Jack Brewer and Erica Lukes at Expanding Frontiers Research reported the story Saturday, citing a case summary they obtained from the Orange County Superior Court of California. In July of 2020, Harzan was arrested in Newport Beach, California, for eliciting sex from a detective posing as a child online. Harzan was removed from his position in MUFON after his arrest became public. Painted lady butterflies fly from West Africa to South America, a new study finds. A new study published in Nature Communications Tuesday used various methods to find that a small group of painted lady butterflies, Vanessa Cardui, flew all the way to South America from West Africa, after likely being born in Western Europe. The dispersal from Africa to South America was a flight without stopping of 4,200 kilometers, or about 2,600 miles, while the migration from Western Europe would make their total journey 7,000 kilometers, or 4,300 miles. The study was conducted by a team of researchers from various countries, including equal contributing authors Tomasz Suchan from the Polish Academy Academy of Science in Krakow, Clement S. Bataille from the University of Ottawa, and Gerard Talavera from Harvard. The study examines a group of butterflies that were sighted and captured in French Guiana on the northeast coast of South America. The butterflies reportedly arrived on a beach after flying vigorously at around 6 a.m. on October 28, 2013. 3 out of 10 of the butterflies were captured alive and used in the study. The researchers project wind patterns backwards from the time and place where the butterflies were found, and find that it was likely these butterflies would have been carried by winds from West Africa. The authors also look at the genetics of the specimens and are able to rule out that these butterflies came from North America, where they are also commonly found. Analysis of pollens on the butterflies' wings find that much of the pollens came from 2 plants endemic to sub-Saharan Africa, the nectar of which the butterflies likely fed on. The authors also examine stable isotope ratios to find that the butterflies were all from the same region and were likely born in Western Europe or else in Northern Africa. The authors are unable to determine how the butterflies were able to make such a long flight, and conjecture that they must have been assisted by trade winds, as well as some form of long-distance flight pattern that relies heavily on gliding to conserve energy. They argue that the butterflies were likely accidentally carried by a, quote, windborne transatlantic dispersal event, unquote. Their flight, the authors said, Their flight, the authors add, likely lasted 5 to 8 days, and only the fittest butterfly individuals survived the journey. The authors conclude that long-distance dispersal events like these remain mysterious, both in terms of how insects are able to survive such events, as well as how common they actually are. Thank you for that. Thank you for your patience with me.
Just knocking stuff off my bookshelf here. What is this? Bob Lazar?
The greatest band.
This is
of the
Hunt for
90s.
the Skinwalker. These are unopened, mint condition.
Oh, are those audiobooks? Okay.
No, they're the scores from Jeremy Corbell's films that I bought in LA at the Lazar film premiere. From that band Red, Blue, Black, Silver. This is actually pretty good music as far as the scores go. But
I never watched those movies.
and a presentation on Socorro by Ben Moss and Tony Aguilera that I bought at some point.
Anyways,
yes, that's a very cool paper. Very cool paper, Louise, that UN almost put out.
Yeah, that took a while to write. I think we started that last year, actually, and then it sort of just dragged on forever. But luckily we were able to release it yesterday. Even then, there were a few little things. One of which you actually pointed to, Jeff, about Matthew Cummings being the acting director of the AOIMSG, one of the precursors of Arrow. So thanks for that.
Yep.
And
yeah, you had actually sent me a copy to read, and I actually did read it, and I read it. I had a Texas speech reader read it to me audibly twice, and then I read through some of it, and I meant to take notes and get back to you, and then it just kind of slipped my mind. So I apologize, I never did that. But it's a good paper, and I was reading it again yesterday or the night before, whenever it came out. Anyways, yeah.
It's already gotten some pushback, incidentally, from Jack Safati.
Oh, yeah.
He was lambasting it because we had erroneously said that John B. Alexander has a PhD in physics, which he doesn't. He's got a PhD in education from 1980. Yeah. But we corrected that straight away. I don't know where the erroneous notion came from that he had a PhD in physics, but we just corrected that. And Safati was using that as like a reason to basically, trash the entire paper.
So, do you know where he got his PhD at? Like, I would assume it would be like some correspondence program or night school or something.
No, it was. I think it was a legit PhD. Let me just look it up.
Where was it that Kevin Randall got his PhD from?
Well, according to Cal Korff, he doesn't actually have one.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
But John B. Alexander got his from Walden University.
Okay, cool.
That's a private for-profit online university in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I don't know anything about that. For some reason, we'd said he had a PhD in physics. Maybe we conflated his interest in physics, and then we saw on his book it says PhD, and then we just sort of put those together. But I don't remember why we said that at the beginning. But anyway, that was a minor mistake that we made. Safati, by the way, for those who don't know, he was he's got a Cornell. I think he's a PhD from Cornell in physics, and he talks a lot about UFOs. But he believes that he's being contacted by a UFO from the future.
He's so certain that he's got the physics right.
Mhm.
Sephardi's a weird character, a very strange guy that has a notorious mailing list that, you know, once you're on it, he never lets you off of it. So yeah, and he's mentioned in that book by what's that guy's name, David Kaiser, the how the hippies took over physics, as being part of, you know, one of those groups of people, you know, in California in the 70s. But I guess there's a lot of question as to how involved he actually was, like how much work it came from him. And yeah, he's an interesting dude. Interesting guy, sure.
My mic is just stretching out my shirt. I just want to point that out. Lampshade that in there.
Yeah.
Luis, was my story, did it have any inaccuracies?
No, except I wouldn't just say that they're pseudoscientists. I mean, they've done some actual science, but I think that their interests overlap a lot with pseudoscientific and kind of paranormal interests. And so like whenever they're in that mode or that, you know, interest area, they kind of, to put it politely, they risk doing pseudoscience.
That's
Yeah,
something.
but
yeah,
I mean, wouldn't you say that like NIDS was entirely a pseudoscientific endeavor, though?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Because it came in with a paranormal expectation. The people who were gathered for it were basically, they all believed in this stuff. And, but I mean, Jeff, you probably know more about this. Didn't they themselves sort of have a few skeptical takes here and there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like NIDS, for example, and John Alexander, the Corso book, they put out a thing saying that was basically garbage. That like these technology developments, you know, came from actual people over history, not from alien spacecraft. So there are cases where they did come out and say, you know, like, yeah, this is nonsense, this is bunk, but they did, you know, also, you know, embrace a lot of kind of goofy stuff. That's the kind of problem with scientists, is that like just because you have a PhD or a scientist doesn't like exclude you from having beliefs and things. And when you have that scientific belief, you kind of you get this bias that you can't be fooled. Like a lot of smart people think they can't be conned, for example, and that's exactly why they can be conned. They put too much belief in their own intelligence to like see through stuff that they just completely miss things. And then they can also kind of use those science skills in pursuit of the kind of their own confirmation bias. And that's what I see with a lot of groups that pretend to be scientific, like these scientific UFO organizations that start up. And yeah, they're all scientists. They're all very brilliant people that I'm sure have done excellent work in whatever the relevant individual fields are. But the problem is that they come into this topic, they kind of already believe stuff, and then they use those sciences to kind of shoehorn, you know, the solutions that they're looking for. And they're not really starting off from an unbiased perspective when they're looking at a case. And like that's what I see with things like SCU and other such organizations, is that and they kind of start off with the assumption it's a mystery and then try and prove it's a mystery, instead of, you know, trying to come up with a solution first before they decide it's a mystery.
And that's actually one of the critiques we make in the paper, is that Bass, they had like all these cases that they looked at, but from kind of like they're taking the most extreme interpretation. Like they take these sighting reports and then they just assume that those are actual bona fide space aliens or some other paranormal activity, and then they go with like the exotic physics explanations for that. I mean, I think it's fine to speculate about physics, but like you have to distinguish between what's real and what's imagined, because like they just basically go with whatever report is out there. They assume it's real and then they just go with that, and then they go off into like the most speculative, you know, thought.
Yeah, that's exactly the issue with a lot of people. Like they'll reference Kevin Newth's paper with Robert Powell that was published in Entropy on the performance characteristics of like UAP sightings, and they look at various sightings and they, you know, do all this math and physics and figure out the G forces that would be required and all this other stuff. And it's not that there's anything wrong with their math or any of that stuff. It's that they're starting with the assumption that all the details in that original case, like you mentioned, were true and factually accurate. Like, so it's valid math and science being done on assumptions that aren't proven, basically.
Yeah.
And so it's speculation. So as when they look at all those old cases and those papers, for example, or like Kevin Newth gives these presentations at SCU over the last couple of years, where he'll calculate these extreme G forces and accelerations, but they're looking at old cases and assuming those details that are being told are true, like assuming it actually went from here to here in 1 second, like, but you don't know that. So
yeah.
But it looks good if you're not like a scientist, like if you come to this topic and like, so that's why people keep referencing these papers, and they in their mind, it's almost as if they've proven these UFOs are going these speeds and doing these things. And it's like, no, that's just speculative, work based on assumptions. But people don't know that if they don't understand or read the paper. And that's kind of always the problem with, you need to be able to communicate science effectively to the public, because a lot of times the public's just completely incapable of understanding they can't see through the bunk when people dress stuff up in the trappings of science. And that's literally how the entire paranormal entertainment, industry works, basically, is dressing things up in the trappings of science, making it look like, hey, we've got these fancy instruments, we're doing all this cool stuff out on site. Like, it looks good to the uninitiated. It looks very scientific and legit, but it's not.
Well, congratulations on your work, Luis. I haven't had a chance to really go in depth with it, and hopefully I'm going to do that really soon. But I have skimmed through the entire thing, and I thought that it was really good.
Thanks.
So let's move on to Jeff's piece. I'm just going to go over my notes here. I just wanted to thank Jeff, first of all, for helping promote the intellectual rigor and honesty we're trying to foster on this show by providing an errata segment for his Jan Wolski piece. I thought that was super cool, and this is exactly the type of thing we're hoping to promote here. I was really intrigued also by Gideon Reed's remark about the Canary Islands case from 1976, which also involved figures seen inside of a luminous shape. That case was found by Vicente Juan Ballester Olmos and Ricardo Campo Perez to likely have been caused by Poseidon missile launches. And I know that Gideon has written and talked a lot about this case as well. It would be really cool to do a segment on this sometime, actually. Do you think
he just published an article a few days ago on it that I highly recommend people check out on his blog.
Do you think that there could be similar optical stimuli at play in both the Rosedale cases and the Canary Islands case?
I don't know. It's hard to say, because with the Canary Islands case, it's like a very, very distant kind of like thing that people are seeing. Like Rosedale, it's supposedly only 200 feet in front of her, and not only does she see the light, but she sees a separate occupant walking around over there. And I don't know what kind of, it's hard to think of what kind of natural kind of like light phenomenon or even artificial light phenomenon out there would have caused that. Yeah, it's weird. I did find, or I was watching a show and kind of found another case that involved a box. Only it was a red box instead of like a white bright light. It was just like an intense red light box. And this was more recently in Russia, I think back in 2012. And the box, it went from a straight up box to kind of then being more trapezoidal, and she saw a figure standing in it. And had I had time, I would have whipped up a slide and put it up. But so there's a few other cases I'm coming across, and some other cases that sort of sound similar, at least in that they sort of just initially see like a bright light or like a box, and they see figures in it. In some of those cases later on, they see more of a structure to the craft, but there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of these square light cases. But
this kind of I just popped into my head. Wasn't there like a early 2000s case with like police witnesses spread over a large area where they were seeing these kind of rectangular lighted craft things.
Oh,
It
you
turns out to be
thinking
like
about
something.
the Illinois 2005 that David Marlowe investigated with all the police? Yeah, the Southern Illinois Triangle case thingy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course there's plenty of cases that are more like almost paranormal or supernatural, like portal like cases where people see like doors or doorways like in the forest or whatever. And I actually just watched yesterday a new movie, The Watchers, by M. Night Shyamalan's. Is it his daughter? It's produced by M. Night Shyamalan, who did Signs and Sixth Sense. And it's about the Watchers, or they say some call them Fae or aliens or angels or whatever. And there's basically a doorway that opens up in the forest that she has to run into, and when she gets inside the door, it's safe, but it's kind of like a dimensional doorway portal to like a little pocket world or something that these Watchers keep them in. But so there's plenty of doorways and portal-like cases. They're just not really explained as UFOs or objects that are flying away elsewhere, disappearing elsewhere. But in this case, in the Rosedale case, she again didn't actually see an object, and she never saw anything fly away either. She basically just saw that box of light. She saw what looked like structure and instrument panels inside the box of light, but it really effectively was a doorway. If it wasn't for that burnt, scorched earth that they found on the ground, you wouldn't even think it was a craft. It would be more just like a paranormal, like doorway kind of portal case. So
interesting. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff in the chat?
Do we have anyone in the chat today?
We can return to that if anyone does. So I'm going to move on to, well, I guess I'll move on to my piece. I don't have any notes on my piece, though. So does anyone have anything they would like to say or ask? Or
one thing I was just going to mention is...
right. Actually, yeah, I was going to say that Jeff had noticed an error in my piece that it's not F.E. Hayden. I copied that from Daniel Cohen's book and should have checked back with other sources. It's actually S.E. Hayden that Edda Pegas was talking about in reference to the Aurora crash.
That's not what I was going to mention, though.
Go ahead.
Where did that book go? Anyways, I was going to say mentioned the historian lady that said how there wasn't even a windmill on the property.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, she did say that. I will point out, supposedly there actually was a windmill on the property that was found when they investigated, when they came in later and investigated. That doesn't actually change anything, really. Like, it was still a made-up story. But I just wanted to point out that there allegedly was a windmill that they found pieces of on the property later on. She may have been wrong about that, but it still was a fictional story.
That was just a windmill that was on the craft, though. It was like, like a saucer with a windmill on top.
Well, it was actually just a TARDIS disguising itself with its chameleon circuit as a windmill.
My bad. Yeah. Thank you.
But it wasn't the Doctor, because it would have just been a phone booth. So it must have been the Master visiting 1897 in Aurora, Texas.
It was some Time Lord or whatever.
Yeah, maybe it was the Ronnie. Have you guys watched the Aurora, Texas movie?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, we watched that together, I think. I think we watched that at the same time. I mean, not together,
on YouTube,
but like
maybe, or
same
something.
time online. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty corny, but it's kind of funny.
It's really corny.
And there's some cool songs too about the Aurora, Texas crash that have been made. Like one's kind of like old timey kind of like song, but it's still kind of fun. It's cool.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that Lodi case is pretty interesting too. The Lodi, California case. I did a show with a Twitter Space this week with Lou Angeles, and somebody was asking me like what the first abduction was, and I was like, well, I mentioned the Lodi case, like supposedly for one of the first abduction attempts, but there was also other supposed abduction attempts in the airship era. There's like that one case where supposedly the occupants like tried to grab the guy, but they were too weak. Like they weren't strong enough to bring him into the airship, and so they weren't successful.
Yeah, I talked about that one too.
Yeah, so like it's very, very interesting that all these things go way, way back.
Mm-hmm. Okay, did you have anything you wanted to say, Luis?
Mm-mm.
Okay, I have some notes on your piece, and I'm just gonna go through them really quick. First of all, I feel for listeners out there, I think it's really important to emphasize that China is like, it's not really China overall that Luis is concerned with, and I think this is pretty clear, but more the Chinese Communist Party. Luis is, of course, not anti all things China, like anti-Chinese culture or anti-Chinese people. He's only against China's oppressive ruling party. I think most of our viewers would, at least hopefully, agree that the CCP is a bad thing, and their treatment of the Uyghur people is really unspeakably terrible. So here's a quote from Luis's piece that I'm just going to go ahead and read. Another thing to note here, those who see the US as simply another great power in a great power contest with China and Russia are actually falling for and parroting the cynical worldview, itself fully believed by many in the Chinese establishment, that great powers are only out for more power and resources. This not only leaves US allies and liberal democracies out to dry, why bother standing up for them if the US is just another brutal hegemon that cares nothing for democracy? And why stand up for liberal democracy if it is just another variant of exploitative capitalism? I think that while there may be, unquote, I think that while there may be people who actually do this, holding a stance that is critical of the US as a superpower, is certainly not the same thing as parroting Chinese communist ideology, because someone's belief happens to correspond to someone else's belief in some way. It does not mean that that one belief was caused by the other, or even that these beliefs are fundamentally related, just that they happen to correspond. Correlation is not the same thing as causation. So in other words, just because China is critical of the US and I am critical of the US, this does not mean that I listen to or agree with the Chinese Communist Party in any other way. Leftists in the US and other Western countries like me are, to widely differing degrees, influenced by a Marxist view of history. But of course, this does not mean that leftists in the West remotely condone Leninism. And indeed, the main concern of leftism in the West is combating systemic oppression. For this very reason, most leftists are deeply critical of the CCP, as well as all other totalitarian regimes. We don't view communist autocracies as good at all or sympathize with them. So the people Luis refers to who, quote, see the US and simply another great power, unquote, must be therefore very different from leftists like myself or other leftists I've interacted with as an American. Another quote from Luis's piece, quote, but it also adopts a deeply historical and empirically invalid outlook that ignores that great power contests have always been as much about spreading ideas as they have been about resources, markets, and power. The US has sought to promote a liberal world order in which liberal capitalism and open institutions are the ideal to which all countries should ultimately aspire, unquote. I agree. And I agree that nobody can ignore the history of the use of ideology in geopolitical battles from the end of World War II to today, at the very least. Indeed, indeed, cough. Most leftist critiques of both the CCP and the US military-industrial complex hold this fact as fundamental to their arguments. The US has often, throughout post-war history, used an ideology of spreading democracy to justify all sorts of actions that were either deeply unethical or else that had huge consequences for countries with less power than the US, often negative consequences. These include actions abroad, such as the Iran-Contra affair, in which the Reagan administration illegally and covertly sold arms to Iran in order to provide funding for right-wing rebel groups in Nicaragua, or the US bombing raids on and negligence towards Cambodia during the Vietnam War, which led not only to many civilian casualties on the part of the US, but also to the mass genocide that took place there at the hands of the Khmer Rouge. And I'll be providing some references in the chat here. The US has also perpetrated crimes against its own citizens firmly on the basis of protecting freedom and democracy. This includes McCarthyism, when there was an active campaign in the US government to root out citizens with communist beliefs. This led to many people being falsely accused of being communist, which of course is not itself even a crime, and also led to many people losing their jobs. COINTELPRO, a covert operation perpetrated by the FBI, actively spied on political dissidents on the justification that they threaten American freedom. These included many counterculture activists like Abby Hoffman, and it also included Black activists like members of the Black Panther Party, whose goal was to strengthen and support Black communities while protecting them against active racism. It also included spying on other Black activists like Martin Luther King Jr., as well as feminists. MKUltra, a clandestine foray into pseudoscience by the CIA, was promulgated by a Korean War fear that China had mastered the ability to supposedly brainwash people. It led to the unethical treatment of American and Canadian citizens, as well as the death of Frank Olson, which was very likely a deliberate assassination by the CIA. I didn't include a reference there, but that point actually comes from the Errol Morris miniseries Wormwood, which is specifically about the death of Frank Olson. Not only this, but the US will actually use the ideology of spreading democracy to falsely justify foreign policy. In his video essay Hypernormalization, Adam Curtis describes how the Reagan administration used Muammar Gaddafi as a figurehead and misrepresented his role in the Arab world as a part of a PR campaign just to justify their actions and the US actions overseas. And here's a link to that video, that movie. The Bush administrations used similar PR tactics. George W. Bush's administration responded to the September 11th attacks by claiming that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction and that Iraq was colluding with al-Qaeda. This led to Bush's vaguely defined war on terror, as well as a protracted war with Iraq, a country that still deals with the social consequences of that war to this day on the basis of the administration's false claims. And obviously Bush, was trying to spread freedom and democracy. Here's some more information on that. I would not only say that it is ahistorical to pretend that American foreign policy and domestic policy are not driven by American ideology. I would go further to say that it is ahistorical to pretend that this ideology is, static or always justified, or that it is free from the influences of conservatism and authoritarianism that are sometimes against freedom and democracy. Reducing the modern course of history to simply a dialectic between communism and liberal democracy is a vast oversimplification of modern history, or for that matter, autocracy versus liberal democracy. And it's a vast oversimplification of American history just on its own terms. The danger of this type of view of history is that it overlooks the real threats that authoritarian thinking like those among Republicans, the religious right, MAGA supporters, and racist far-right extremists promote. It ignores the threat of fascism in the US to a certain degree, not entirely and not explicitly, but I think that it does to a certain degree. This is a threat that was realized in Americans' minds by the election of Donald Trump and further by the January 6 riots. But the reduction of modern history and current global conflict to a simple ideological conflict also ignores the fact that despite being ruled by a communist party, China is, for all practical terms, a capitalist country. They are, of course, internally communist and totalitarian, but the economic power and economic growth of China rests on their trading of consumer goods with other countries to grow their economy. I support Chinese dissidents who want to work to overthrow the CCP, But I also think that it is very likely that the US Pentagon will play only a minor role in this, if not a completely dysfunctional one, given the US military's pedigree of making things worse in Asian countries. And the real threat to the CCP is, just as Min-Shin Pei argued, socioeconomic conditions, like the continued growth of an educated Chinese middle class. Pei writes, quote, if the fate of post-totalitarian communist dictatorships in the old Soviet bloc is any guide, a bet worth making is that China's long journey from Maoism to neo-Stalinism via a 3-decade trip through post-totalitarianism will be seen as a historical detour that delayed but could not prevent a rendezvous with democratic change, unquote. Is the Chinese Communist Party a threat? Of course it is. But if we pretend that the US simply represents liberal democracy and it's that simple, and we ignore all of the negative consequences of unethical actions by US presidential administrations and the US military and the CIA and the FBI, then it's much easier to justify any action on the part of the US government without considering the actual ethics or ramifications of the actions of the US military and other countries. Simply because this position happens to align with the CCP's description of events, neither means that such a position is not true, or even that it is in any way fundamentally consonant with Marxism-Leninism. I think we should be less worried about a threat from the Chinese Communist Party and more worried about the threats within the US of military action without oversight, of political corruption, and the potential of the US government to being manipulated by wealthy companies, or worse, fascistic movements. Because after all, the ultimate goal of Chinese psychological warfare is to promote autocracy in liberal countries, right? So promoting a view of history where the US is simply the good guy and China is the bad guy, a Manichaean worldview, if there ever was one, works for rather than against the CCP's agenda. So those are my, not trying to be mean or anything or start an argument, but that's my 2 cents.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that right now there's more similarity between somebody like Orban in Hungary and supposedly he called himself a sort of conservative or an anti-communist, but I think that in some ways there's more overlap between him and Xi Jinping. And so, the authoritarian versus liberal divide, it's kind of a bit weird these days because you've got a lot of overlap between sort of, even like Elon Musk, right? Quintessential so-called libertarian entrepreneur. He uses Twitter as basically a platform to amplify Russian propaganda, or at least that's the effect, and Chinese propaganda as well. Some people don't even see the contradiction in that. So these days, that dichotomy is a little bit stranger than it used to be. But I was really speaking in broad contour when I was talking about the US being overall a force for good, at least in comparison to China. I'm not trying to say that the US is simply the good guy, but that if you look at it in relative terms, the US does at least promote a social system, liberal democracy, that is undoubtedly a huge advance in the history of civilization. And I think it's really, it's naive to deny that. Like just the rights which are available to people in liberal democracies are pretty much unprecedented in human history. Now, that doesn't excuse US crimes, but it still might put them into perspective. So, like the US during the Cold War, it was in a kind of, the other guy is trying to like blink, seeing who blinks first, that sort of thing. And in that sort of contest, it wasn't always clear like that you could just let the other guy get away with something. So that was sort of the backdrop for why the US supported all these nasty anti-communist regimes during the Cold War. And to an extent does that as well today. The other thing was China is capitalist. I mean, you said that China is communist internally. It's got a Marxist-Leninist structure. Even if they don't believe in this stuff, they've still got a Marxist-Leninist apparatus.
Right.
And,
but my
China,
go ahead.
Its growth has been thanks to capitalism. So like we can't simultaneously say that capitalism is the problem here when the very thing that's allowed China to get out of its backwater status, like which it was in 1970s, when the warming of relations happened between China and America. How do we reconcile that, saying that capitalism is the problem and then acknowledging that it is a communist state and a communist regime?
Well, because capitalism is not an internal system. Like capitalism isn't about, like, it's not like capitalism is just any exchange of money. China is a capitalist country in the sense that its economy depends entirely on capitalist trade, basically. I mean, not entirely necessarily.
State capitalism is what they call it.
Yeah, exactly. It's just it's capitalism, but with a communist government, basically. So and I think there's this kind of tension between internal governance and global and international politics too, right? So when America is being a liberal democracy internally, that's very, very different. In fact, it's often just the complete opposite of America trying to promote liberal democracy in other countries. Because in terms of, like, what does a liberal democracy do? They provide, a voice and social welfare and all of these things to their citizens to make sure that all of the citizens are being given, a fair stake and that their rights are being protected, that kind of thing. But in terms of spreading liberal democracy, historically, what that meant is basically fighting other countries and doing like covert actions in other countries and things like that, which
I'd argue that's more Chicago school style neoliberalism than just standard liberal democracy.
I mean, yeah, I'm not even talking in economic terms, but that's the thing too, is that a liberal democracy in
No, I'm talking about how they go into other countries. That was Chicago school.
Oh, I don't know, I'm sorry.
Like the Chile, like coup in Chile, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
the Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, and the documentary goes into a lot of
For sure, the US has often placed capitalism ahead of democracy.
Absolutely.
But disaster capitalism.
By this, on the other hand, you mentioned wars and covert operations. Those were done against Nazi Germany during World War II through the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA. And the US did provide huge support to the countries fighting against the Nazis. And the effect of that ultimately was that Western Europe, at least, which was not under Soviet control, was it was mostly liberal democracies there.
Yeah, well, I think that really what my question, or what my main concern is how do we stop war from happening, and how do we stop oppression from happening in the future? Like, I think that's really what everyone's main political goals should be, right? That we should prevent any kind of war, that there shouldn't be a conflict in Israel or Palestine, or that there shouldn't be these geopolitical conflicts between superpowers. I don't think that it's the ideological beliefs about how a country is run that governs these conflicts, or that is going to stop these conflicts in any way. It's really going to be, some, I don't know, but I don't think that, yeah, sure, liberal democracy is good in terms of what it does for the people within its country. It's not perfect, but it's like you said, it's a massive improvement on some other types of political systems. But sorry.
What about? You said how to stop. We should be stopping wars, but sometimes wars are the only option. because the alternative is to let, for example, Saddam Hussein gobble up Kuwait in 1991. You know, that he chose that war, and then there are people on the left in America saying America shouldn't have gone to war against Iraq because there were diplomatic options on the table and other things like that. But that's like, how do you prevent that from becoming like the dictators being rewarded for their behavior?
Well, I'm not saying that all war is unjustified. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we want a world that doesn't have war in it. Like everyone wants peace. Like that should be our end goal. You know what I'm saying? And I don't think that trying to spread a particular country's ideology is going to do that. Right? I mean, yeah, sure. Obviously, if all the countries in the world were liberal democracies, everyone would have a much better time. They would have a higher standard of living, and there would probably be less wars. But the US vying for power, you know, is the US vying for power, whether or not, you know, it has an ideology behind it? And the question is really, you know, how do we make the US Department of Defense and the US government, you know, more accountable, and also behave in a more ethical way, and in a more consequentialist way, right? Because historically, the US military has not behaved in a way where it was considering the consequences of its actions.
So, well, that leads on to the question of, in the meantime, what do we do about China and Russia?
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, you know, I don't think that it's a problem of, you know, trying to fight autocracies. I don't think that's a problem. And I think that a lot of the suggestions that you made are, in terms of what we should do, are actually really good suggestions. But I'm still also extremely skeptical of the Pentagon and allying with the Pentagon, because the Pentagon historically has done really shady stuff, and they often operate without a lot of oversight. I mean, you know, this whole, you know, the skinwalker at the Pentagon thing that your paper deals with has a lot to do with that. Like, you basically had these people from the public sphere manipulating people within the Pentagon, you know, behind closed doors, right? And that's how all that stuff took place. So, like, if someone in the Pentagon is trying to fight the Chinese Communist Party, but they decide in doing so that they can do some other, you know, unethical thing, like perpetrate disinformation against the American public or something like that covertly, you know, there's no oversight. I mean, I'm sure there's some measure of oversight, but, and I'm not, you know, I got to say right now, I don't know what your two backgrounds is in political science or in foreign policy. You know, it sounds like, you know, Luis, you have a very intelligent and nuanced take on all of this, and you think a lot about it. I'm not an expert on the topic, you know, but you know, these are my opinions and beliefs, that kind of thing. Lampshade.
Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, I just would say that those are all nice goals and ideals to have. I think many people have strived for that forever. Like, most people don't want war. They would like peace. They'd like prosperity. They'd like all these things. But the fact of the matter is that, like, we'll always have them. There will always be geopolitical conflict. There will always be war between nations. There will always be war and conflict internally. Like, there will always be these issues. And the issue I see is that a lot of these people, they like to call out what they see as a problem, whether they're blaming like capitalism for climate change, which makes zero sense, or, you know, liberal democracy for all the world's problems or whatever. They don't actually have any solutions to, you know, change things. Like, and I think a lot of these people fail to understand the kind of complex world we live in, and would like to live in this kind of like nice, happy world and think that we should get there, but it's just not practically like going to happen. I don't know. I'm not really a political guy. Like, I don't really follow politics all that much, and Like I said, to be honest, I didn't even know that they were having a debate this week until it was already over, and I have not watched it. That's how little I care about politics. But
yeah, I'm not good at following politics either.
yeah,
I think I just want to say that the leftist position again is really about fighting oppression. Is against autocracy. So leftists are the kinds of people who would absolutely engage in things like covert operations and psychological warfare and like hacking into like other countries' internets and stuff like that, and see that as completely politically justified. And the left is also very solution oriented as well, though usually what the left's actions are usually oriented towards are to solve specific problems, and they set up specific goals, right? Like providing this group of people with more rights, or providing this particular country with more autonomy, or protesting this type of damage to the environment, those sorts of things. So they're not like, so I would not say that the left is not solution oriented. It's just that the left prioritizes things differently from people that are a lot more moderate.
How do you counter the charge that every experiment in trying to get rid of capitalism has ended in disaster and even more oppression for the people that it was supposedly trying to help?
Well, I think I don't think that leftism today, contemporary leftism, is entirely throw out capitalism, right? Just like leftism isn't just like about throwing out everything, right? It's really just about changing the system. It's not about revolution, but about evolution a lot of the time. Sometimes it is about revolution when, right, like a country requires a political revolution, obviously. But like in a place like where we're at, it's not like leftists are fighting to, destroy the U.S. or the U.S. government. That's not what they're doing at all. In fact, most leftists, who are really engaged in activism are really civically engaged as well, and do things like vote and go to town hall meetings and all that stuff, like so the left is against capitalism in the same way that the left is against war, where we have these really broad historical goals of being like, how do we live in a world that is peaceful? How do we live in a world where the oppression of capitalism no longer exists? Not just like, oh, let's just throw it all away, right? Let's just forget about it, And I want to correct when I said anarchy in the last Ufos Chat episode, that I wasn't talking about anarchism, and I'm really sorry that I said that way, because I'm not entirely against anarchism per se. I don't think that like there will ever be like an anarchist country or whatever. I'm not sure if that's like feasible, but I do think that anarchism in political action has its uses, right? And a thing that I would add too is that the left has a long history of actually producing positive results. The left was very involved in labor unions in the early 20th century, in feminism, in the Black civil rights movement, right? And a lot of these different social movements that actually yielded results, like adding amendments to the Constitution, or the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Those are coming from the left, those kinds of products in culture, and those are positive. Those are good things. And those, if people didn't do stuff like that in America, if there weren't leftist dissidents in America, we would be living in a much more kind of repressive, Victorian-looking type of culture,
Probably, yeah. I agree with you on that. But I am always, I'm wary of like extremism on both sides, because as I say in my Twitter profile, I'm anti-communist, but also anti-fascist.
Yeah,
and I think there are limits to.
I think that's like where we really agree on, is that we're both very anti-fascist. And for me, the fear is what kinds of tendencies in the US could lead to a successful fascist or autocratic movement, right? Sorry, Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I think Jeff wanted to say something. maybe.
No, really. I was just going to mention that I actually just saw like a meme about this yesterday about how I think it was under a Greta Thunberg post or something, where somebody was talking about how awful the world is now. Or like they saw a homeless person on the street, living on a bench, and how it wasn't like this 100 years ago, before all these. And they were basically trying to blame it on the left, is why the standard of living is supposedly crap. And so this person posted a meme of like literally families living in shacks in America, in like the 1930s and 40s, tar paper shacks and, and extreme poverty and stuff. Is like, really, you want to go back to this before, some of the policies that started to be implemented about 100 years ago? It's like people tend to have like this kind of like fantasy idea of like what the past was like, it was perfect back then, and it really wasn't. Like, like you did mention, a lot of that stuff that came out of like, Wilson and after, kind of improved quality of life for a lot of Americans over what it was back then. And I'm all for like there's no doubt the U.S. government's done a lot of horrible things. And I'm absolutely for more accountability, and I'm for more regulation on a lot of stuff. And I don't think getting rid of capitalism is really like a feasible kind of like idea that will ever take place. I do, like I said, I'm absolutely for more regulation. Like, I think just like unrelenting capitalism, where we just let billionaires collect all the wealth and where all the rest of us, are poor, is not cool. So I'm for more regulation, but I don't see other solutions for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
the truth is we live in a globally connected world now, where we can't just like deal with what's going on within our borders and let everybody else do whatever they want to do over elsewhere. Like it just doesn't work that way, because what we do affects people elsewhere, and what they do affects us here. We're all connected, and so we all have a stake in these conflicts, and that's why we get involved in some of them. That's why we provide aid to like the Ukraine, because it does affect us and world stability if you just let Putin run around wild, like taking over things. And so the fact is like, this is a big world now. There's a lot more people on it, and we're all connected. And so some of these systems, while they can be improved, I don't see possible replacements or solutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Mark Fisher, right? He wrote a whole book about this, and he was a leftist thinker, right? And it was
the ontology one.
Yeah, and it's basically about how we live in a world where we can't imagine an alternative to capitalism, basically. And the left views this as a bad thing. The left isn't saying that we can just eradicate war, we can eradicate capitalism in one fell swoop. It's going to be something that takes a long time, right? We're not Marxist-Leninists. We're not like trying to just, build our own country just immediately or something like that. I think that's completely absurd. But I do think that, having that dream, like John Lennon's Imagine of dreaming of a world that is, a world built on egalitarianism and peace, is a worthy dream. It's a worthwhile dream of having, and like, if there's an end to history, like, Francis Fukuyama talks about, I think in a leftist vision of history, the end of history is something like that, where everyone has the same rights and freedoms in the world, and the same opportunities and the same, resources.
And couldn't this get like, I did do a talk on this show about the nuclear rockets, nuclear thermal rockets, and how, I forget the author's name, but he was talking about how, in his view, he thinks that these are necessary for long-term deep space exploration and colonization, and that this may actually have a huge benefit on humanity, because it could relieve tensions on Earth, and it could also foster a type of cosmological or cosmic worldview among people. I mean, previously you said, Rachel, that you don't think space is that important, but couldn't it be seen as important in terms of like everybody sees themselves as part of a, little dot, the blue Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, right?
Yeah.
That's a cosmic perspective. And Neil deGrasse Tyson has also mentioned this.
The free Martian Republic.
Yes, well, I think that absolutely that science and space science too. Like, I'm not totally anti-space science, but I'm just, think that space science should, just like any other kind of science or technology development in the world, should really be focused on how to be more green and how to be sustainable, and really, really be prioritizing that. But I do think that absolutely leveraging space science to create bridges across cultures, across countries, across ideologies, I think that's a wonderful project, actually, and that there could absolutely be stuff like that in the future. And so, like, I'm not anti-space science, right? I just think that, the kinds of, I don't think we should be prioritizing STEM. I think we should be prioritizing, we should, but a different kind of STEM, right? A STEM that is prioritizing the sciences that are really, really critical, but are also really, really immature, like psychology, sociology, anthropology, and but also prioritizing more, of course, biology and ecology as well, because those are super important right now. I think that stuff is more important than space science. So that whole piece about the dusky seaside sparrow wasn't really a reflection on the modern state of things, but it was really just a historical piece about what happened in NASA's past. And I think I should have made that more clear, and I think that I made an error in not doing that. Because really what I wanted to do was make a piece about the dusky seaside sparrow and emphasize just how important the dusky seaside sparrow is as a population of living beings, and how those are just gone forever, right? Because of this prioritization of this like American exceptionalist dream of going to the moon and stuff. And I think that that whole project within NASA and the US government at that time period was a little bit misguided.
I think that going to the moon per se was a good thing, because it was a Cold War contest with a lot of prestige hanging on it. But I don't think that necessarily, I would have liked NASA to keep going after, what was it, Apollo 17. But I can understand critiques of that, other more pressing social concerns. But I think that the moon mission, the moonshot per se, was legitimate.
Yeah, I think it was definitely a huge achievement, and it's really remarkable and amazing. But I don't necessarily think that, I don't think that if I was alive at the time that the Apollo, and I was an adult, with similarly adulty views, that I would have been like supporting the Apollo mission, because I probably would have been hanging out with a bunch of leftists and hearing, the kinds of things that, folks like Vonnegut or Gil Scott-Heron, or if there was someone like Sarah Scoles making those types of arguments, I've been listening to that kind of thing. But yeah, no, I think that this idea of having this contest of showing who is technologically superior was very. I think that it was a big PR thing, and it isn't really an accurate representation of science, or a positive representation of science. I think a much better and more useful one is like when, for example, when Einstein was trying to demonstrate his theories and was working with scientists in other countries to make these observations of gravitational lensing or something like that.
Which required the space program and NASA being able to go up there to confirm.
This was before NASA, though. I'm talking about like
but not ultimately confirmed until we were able to go up there and put up probes and actually make real measurements.
Right, but the example that I'm using here is really about the historical and cultural perception of science, and the utility of it, I guess, because so. I think a much more useful way to portray science publicly is science as building bridges across cultures and people working together despite political divides, as opposed to science as being a competition, right?
I'd argue the space program is one of the most internationally collaborative programs out there. It's one of the only programs where we actually work with a lot of people we usually consider enemies.
I mean, that's a good point, but at the same rate, though, NASA's space program during the Cold War was very much about Cold War politics, and the space race was a space race. That's what it was, right? It was a space race between the U.S. and the USSR, and it was very much about a competition between two global superpowers vying for power, and it was all about engaging the public.
But thank goodness it wasn't the Soviets who won that campaign.
Right, but they wouldn't have anyway, right?
Do you think if the Soviets weren't doing it, we would have just not even wanted to go to space, though? I think we would have.
No, I think that we would have. Yeah, I think we would have.
But there's no doubt we used that politically. It was kind of like a standoff and a competition, but I still think we would have done it anyways.
But even if we hadn't, I think the PR aspect is a legitimate aspect. I mean, the US was competing against a totalitarian ideology. So like, even if it wasn't just about science and it was a geopolitical contest, I think that's completely fine. Science doesn't just have to be about discovery. It can also be about serving the needs of a society or a state.
I mean, it's been argued we bankrupted the Soviet Union and caused its collapse because of that, which would be a net positive, even if that's all that happened.
I don't think the U.S. actually caused the collapse of the USSR.
We expedited it.
Yeah.
We what?
We expedited that.
Well, yeah, but I don't think that we caused it, though. I think the USSR caused that themselves, right? Because they just had an economy. Yeah. I mean,
ultimately, you're responsible for
like they wouldn't have won the space race because they wouldn't have been capable of doing so. And I think that my problem with it is not only does this competition, this competitive way of looking at science, globally competitive between two different superpowers, sort of emphasize a component of conflict, right? Because a competition is a conflict, and this wasn't a friendly competition. It wasn't a game. It was part of the Cold War, right? And it doesn't emphasize what we should really be prioritizing, which is peace and people not being faced with the threat of violence, right?
But how do you do that in Ukraine, for example? I mean, Putin's the one who chose war, not peace. The West, there are voices in America, including on the political right, by the way, who say that we should just have peace. Like Marjorie Taylor Greene says, we should just have peace in Ukraine.
Yeah,
which just translates into slavery.
Yeah, I don't know her perspective. I mean, I support Ukraine, and I do not support Russia in Ukraine at all. I don't support Putin at all. I think that we should just make that really clear. Like, Putin's just terrible, like he's straight from the KGB. Like what he's doing, and to a certain extent, what China is doing, right? I mean, maybe even to similar extents, is they're just continuing this Cold War Manichaeism, like you were talking about, right? And that's a bad thing. That of being us versus them, that's a bad thing, right? And so I think really to combat stuff like that, like Putin, is to be like, hey, why are these people promoting war, and why are these people promoting geopolitical politics? Instead of participating in this ongoing conflict and being like, well, Putin did this, well, Xi Jinping did that, right? Oh, what did China do in response to America being kind to them? They did this. We need to stop being adversarial because diplomats don't do that, right? Because they know that that's bad diplomacy, because it increases conflict. It escalates conflict.
But so does showing weakness. I mean, the reason that Putin invaded is because he perceived the West to be weak on Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, though. That's part of Putin's ideology, and that's part of his PR, right? That's part of, yes, America shouldn't be weak, but also America lowering itself to petty squabbles about geopolitics is showing weakness. It's showing a weakness of being unable to stick to our values.
So, but now you're saying that we do have values.
Well, I mean, I have values. Yeah, absolutely. Everybody has values. I'm not saying, I've made this very clear and I've underlined it multiple times. I'm not denying the existence of ideology or saying that ideology is all bad, right? I just think that we should be clear about, what the ideology is, what it's doing, where it's coming from, and separate ideology from fact, right? Because, saying that my ideology, when I say things like that the US is a hegemon and China says that the US is a hegemon, that doesn't mean that I agree with China. It just means that that point in particular, I believe to be true, even though China said it, right? And yeah, I mean, I think that we should have values. It's just, I think that there's ideologies of values that the US will promote and do so deliberately as a PR campaign, sometimes to manipulate the American public, like what the Bush and what the second Bush administration did, right?
But my point is, with Putin, for example, or China, expand the general point to Taiwan, and
and I support Taiwan. I support Taiwan's independence. I think that they should be acknowledged by the UN.
Right, but like my point is, what is the practical way to deal with these autocrats when they see weakness as an invitation to attack, and they're going to use American military presence as an excuse to be aggressive anyway in their own PR? So what's the practical way to defend Ukraine or Taiwan?
I mean, look, I think that,
because we can have these debates all day here in the safety of America, but like they're the ones facing the danger.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I think that I would want Taiwan, and I would want. I'm sorry, what was the other thing that you mentioned? You said Taiwan and something else.
Ukraine.
Oh, Ukraine. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. No, I think that I don't support Russia being, invading Ukraine at all. I don't support China putting pressure on Taiwan, and I think that, yeah, the US military should be involved in that, I guess. I don't think that that's a perfect solution. I don't entirely like it, because I don't like the US military and I don't like the US being a superpower. I don't like superpowers, right? I think we should be living in a world that's just sort of like
but
the UN, or the EU or something, like the EU or like the Scandinavian whatever.
The EU, yeah, but
whatever.
The EU, yeah, go ahead.
Whatever the U.S. has done, and like I said, it's done a lot of bad stuff. Can you imagine what the world would be like if U.S. wasn't a superpower, though? Like,
I can't.
The fact that we're a superpower has held a lot of other crazy people at bay.
Yeah, right. But the thing is, we can't really imagine that kind of scenario. I mean, we can, but it would be very speculative, because the fact of the matter is,
I don't know how speculative it would be if you understand psychology and history. And
Beth, let me finish. I'm sorry. Now, the thing is that we've never had that kind of historical circumstance. When I was reading through the articles that Luis cited, I really liked the fact that they were really relying on empirical evidence, to a certain extent. And, what Pei's article, I think it was Pei's article, was really nice about. What was really nice about Pei's article was that Pei was really focused on looking at historical examples of being like, hey, China is really different from other countries that, in the past were autocracies and then became democracies, because China is like, I can't remember the exact points that Pei outlined, but basically China is historically very different. And that's the thing, is that we don't live in a world where World War II ended with the Axis winning. So we have no idea what would have happened because nothing like that has ever happened, like never. Like we like global history began in the past like 200 years basically. I mean, like truly global, where we have like world wars and world conflicts and stuff like that. Like, so
Yeah, but yeah, I understand what you mean. But what about a world in which the U.S. chose not to get involved in World War II?
Yeah, I think that might be a worse world. I think possibly, or it might have just been a worse world for like a decade. You're right. Who knows? Because maybe
I
what if
think
the
we wouldn't have had
Nazis
a choice.
like
I
came
think
to
Japan would
power?
have made the West Coast, and we wouldn't have had an option to stay out of the war once they started hitting the West Coast.
Yeah.
So,
Just in terms of the war, yeah, we would have been fighting it on on U.S. land. But I think,
Americans, Canadians, people went over to fight the war long before we officially entered it as well. Like there's a lot of people willing to fight in World War II even before America officially joined the war.
yeah. Well, no, and I think Simon Fly, you really raise a good point. And I think, okay, it's okay to be pragmatic and also to acknowledge these tensions, right? Like to be like, hey, yeah, the U.S. did have to be involved in World War II in order for the world to be a better place, right? But at the same time, the US did actually do a lot of really unethical stuff in the time after that, to the present day, probably. Right. And it's okay to acknowledge both of those things. And also, I think that leftism is at root a pragmatic thing. It's not just about dreams. Like I said earlier, leftists tend to focus on specific goals in activism, right? To like say like help this particular group of people in a specific way, or to promote this particular type of message, and to make this particular kind of change.
Yeah.
I'm not a huge fan of America either. I mean, I do kind of I love it though. It is my country, but I'm not a patriot. I think I might have said something like I'm patriotic or something in the last chat. I say stupid stuff sometimes, but I
think it's better
really,
than other options. I'm just, like I say, there's a lot of things I'm not proud of, but yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's one thing of being like saying like I'm proud of the country from where I'm from, and then on the other hand, being like a MAGA patriot or even just a conservative patriot, because on the one side,
I'm
it's
not really like the nationalism personally.
Yeah. There's a fine line between, like supporting your country and becoming a nationalist, which
thinking you're better than everyone else.
And having this unrealistic belief in your country,
even if you are better than,
really is like the predecessor and like kind of cousin to fascism.
Even if America is not inherently better, it's still often the case that it's the only country that can do a certain intervention.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And sometimes, it's necessary. I think that it's necessary for America to be involved in Ukraine or to support Taiwan militarily, and to have a presence there. But at the same time, though, that doesn't mean that's not the same as saying that I think that the U.S. Is always good, and the U.S. military always does good stuff.
I think in a sense that there'll always be superpowers, just kind of in the sense that things fall into like a 80-20 power rule, right? Like there'll always be some countries that have more resources, more power, more influence than the other countries on the bottom of the list. And so I think it's always been that way in history. I mean, there's been, even if you go back throughout history, you got people like Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, that have gone on their rampages and took over large parts of the known world during their time. So you'll always have these kind of superpowers or empires that have a unnatural amount of influence and control over the world and its geopolitical situation.
Well, I hope not, right? I really hope not,
I just think that's a law of physics. I don't think you can get away from that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think we can.
We all want the
I don't think.
federation. I want the federation as much as everyone, where we all live in peace and
But the
we don't have
Federation,
to work.
the Federation is not realistic. But and talking about peace and talking about not having global conflicts is a dream, right? But I think that's probably the best thing to work towards. I don't think. And
I think
yeah,
the only way you get that is with a one world government, which nobody really wants, which really is what the Federation is a one world government.
right.
And
But
they even talk about it in Star Trek, how like really like it's only when all the countries come together as one and they're just like one government that you can actually enter the the stars with all the other races and whatever. But
it's kind of messed up when you think a lot about it. But
particularly
yeah,
since the
well, I
one world
mean,
government is like a major conspiracy.
I
It's
want
like
to.
one of the big conspiracies.
I want to raise a point though here, which is that right in the past, right, we would have these empires and nations and nation states and stuff like that, and the world was very heterogeneous, right? It wasn't contiguous either. You had these very different realms, like you had the Americas, which were completely separated from Eurasia culturally. I mean, largely for the most part. Like there's some evidence that right
Let's
Polynesia
ask Graham Hancock.
and
Was there a
South
global civilization?
but anyway, setting that aside, right? And as history proceeded, then we got these larger and larger empires. Like China's the Chinese Empire increased dramatically in size, and then you had the British Empire. During the colonialist era, and you had these huge colonialist powers from Western Europe vying for power and vying for land. And now, right, we live in a global world where everyone interacts with each other, and there's just superpowers vying for power, right?
Well, that's not really true, because Russia and China want territorial assimilation of the countries that they threaten, or like the maritime borders. The U.S., for the most part, has stopped doing that. I mean, they took over Hawaii, they took over parts of Mexico back in the day, but like that is not really, part of the international system that America promotes.
No, you're right. America and the UK have definitely made major strides of moving away from colonial imperialism. Absolutely, I totally agree with you, but that doesn't really change the substance of my point, which is basically that, right? Whereas in the past you would just have assortments of cultures and nations and empires, now we live in a global system where there's the vying for power is just vying for sources of global power geopolitically. And the US, while it's not so imperial as it was in the past, is still a superpower and will still do things that superpowers do. I mean, that's just being realistic. I think you would agree with me on that point, but right. So my point is, though, is talking about this description of history that Jeff is putting forth, that basically there will never be a world that is united, or there will never be a world where there is peace, right? Not only do I think it's cynical, but I also think that really the general trend of history over the past 10,000 years, or well, since the beginning of history and prior to history, has been a trend of globalization, right? Of people interacting and trading more and more, and states and countries becoming larger and larger and interacting more and more. And now we're in a very, very global system where we have, huge economic blocks, and huge unions, right? Like the European Union, and trade unions, and huge countries that exert huge amounts of power. And it's just one world. So it seems to me like if that trend continues, then wouldn't it actually be likely that in the future that the world will become more global and less drawn on nationalistic lines, if that makes sense, or state lines, kind of?
Isn't that what the U.S. and the U.S. military strive for, though? Is a integrated world order in which liberal democracy is the preferred social system in which countries prosper through mutual trade. That's why we lambast, countries that violate that by trying to throw their weight around, like Russia and Ukraine, because we're stronger, so we're going to take you over. That's a violation of that globalized system. But it seems like you're saying that the globalization has led to more imperialism. I'm not really clear on what you are.
No, what I'm saying is that the world has gotten smaller, basically. Whereas in the past, countries, right, were smaller and more diverse and less connected to each other. Now countries are much larger and more connected across nations, across cultures, and there are also much more alliances between countries, like the European Union and trade alliances and the UN and stuff like that, right? What I'm saying is that if there's always going to be war and there's always going to be geopolitical conflict, how does that square with the general historical trend in humanity of actually moving towards globalism and greater interconnection and enlargements of cultures and nations? And do you see what I'm saying? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a function of technology, not people moving towards any sort of better system.
I mean, yeah, it is a function of technology, but it's also a function of just, I mean, like, there are a lot of different factors that I think cause globalization to happen, but I just don't think that the trends of globalization square with this idea that the entire human world will continue to be really, really heterogeneous. It seems like it will actually continue to be more about large countries, large alliances, and interconnectedness across cultures. Like, so I guess what I'm saying is that, right, we used to just have petty conflicts between nation states and countries. Now we're living in a period where we have global conflicts between superpowers, but eventually that's going to be replaced with something else, for good or for bad.
Battles with the Galactic Federation and the Sirens. I was just going to mention, I think I mentioned this just briefly at the end of the last show, this guy who had this theory, and it comes from dependency theory. And this guy, Emmanuel Wallerstein, is who I was talking about, and his world systems theory, and how he breaks down, instead of like I was talking about the ideas of like third world countries, developing nations, stuff like that. He breaks it down into like systems where there's basically, and he says his theory explains the rise and fall of all states, all income inequality, social unrest, imperialism. And he breaks the world down into core countries, semi-periphery countries, and then periphery countries. And basically kind of all stuff almost flows upwards, right? Like you've got the core countries that need these resources and these other countries. And sometimes there's countries that are a little bit larger and they'll control regional areas, let's say like Africa, for example. And then you got your periphery countries that really get almost nothing out of the system. They're just basically feeding stuff out. They depend on other countries for everything, their food, everything else, because all they're doing is exporting their own natural resources and not really producing anything internally. And he breaks it down to those kind of categories, which I thought was interesting. Apparently it's a kind of a Marxist expansion of dependency theory, but
yeah, and now watch China trying to make everyone dependent on them.
Yeah,
the core country, it doesn't matter if it's a liberal democracy or a Marxist-Leninist state.
Mm-hmm.
This is really not a critique you can level against liberal democracy, because everyone else is doing it as well.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that liberal democracy isn't really, it acts independently of interactions between different states, basically. I think that was the point that I was trying to make, is basically, yeah, liberal democracy is good and functional within a country, but when a country is acting internationally, it's not doing liberal democracy, even if it's trying to promote liberal democracy. That's not what it's doing.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I think this has been a really wonderful conversation, and I really enjoy talking with you guys.
Somehow these discussion episodes turn into long political conversations.
I don't know how that.
Where are the UFOs at?
It's not. It's okay though. I think that it's fine to talk about politics.
There's a green alien for you guys.
It is UFO adjacent, you know, and China and the U.S. both develop UASs or whatever, balloons, Tic Tacs. They're all involved.
Yeah. Systems.
And I think that, you know, I've been thinking a lot about this military thing. It's really interesting because there does seem to be this kind of boom and bust of sort of UFO and airship stuff, and it seems to have some sort of, you know, that it lines up a bit with geopolitical history, you know, and also technological history as well. But yeah, like before, you know, before World War I, a lot of the airship movies were more fantastical, were more fun and a little bit less serious. And then all of a sudden, around, you know, in the mid 1910s, the tenor kind of changes. Well, first of all, airships become conventional in cinema. But I also think they become a lot less prominent as a feature of a movie that's fantastical or whimsical, unless it's in like cartoons. And there's like this gap, right, in aerial phantom waves, approximately from like, I want to say like 1920 to 1930 or something like, or 1933, right? Sort of it kind of lines up with the interwar period. You know what I mean? So,
and I would say that the phantom plane waves of the 30s also lines up with really massive aeronautical development. You know, when we were starting to really develop these planes. Yeah, we had planes in World War I, pretty relatively simple, like planes. Like the 30s was particularly in Europe, an area of huge airplane development, and particularly where a lot of these waves are being seen. So, yeah.
Were these phantom plane? You know, I need to read way more on this. And I know that I read something by David Clark that was about phantom planes a while back, but it might have been talking about a different era, because when I imagine
scare ships, like so there was like the British scare ship stuff in 1909, like 1913, I think, and
yeah, I mean, what I'm imagining is in, you know, the like in the what is that, in the Peak District, or like in the Midlands, right? That people were seeing like really old planes. Didn't something like that happen? And was that something that was happening in the 30s, or was that something that only happened more like in the later 20th century, like, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s kind of thing?
I think that was more, I think, in the 30s and stuff like that.
Yeah. So it was it feels almost like it was like, you know, whereas like some phantom airship scares are more about anxieties and fears of like invasions from Russia or from Germany. Some of them are more like maybe anxieties that are like ghosts of World War I, you know?
It's been argued that Nuremberg case, you know, the old Nuremberg woodcut, there's different theories. You know, one is that it was sundogs that they saw and they were just kind of illustrating that. But it's been argued that it's not even real is the main theory, and there was actually an allegory because of basically the political climate and fears at the time. I guess having to do with the religious, like, I don't know, like the different Catholics and
and you know,
Huguenots or whoever it was back then. But that it was actually just and unless you understand the cultural and historical context at the time, you read this story and you just think, oh, it's a cool, like, it's an airship sighting or a battle in the sky or whatever happened. But like, no, it was actually just like kind of born out of like fears and anxieties of the area. So, and it wasn't even meant to be literal. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it definitely wasn't sundogs. That's my conclusion. I'm sorry if you disagree with me, but I absolutely
I
do
don't
not
think it ever happened. So, yeah, I don't.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that if it did happen, it wasn't sundogs. I think it's absolutely possible that it didn't happen, but I also kind of think that it might have happened, but it was some sort of weird, rare optical phenomenon related to what Corliss talks about, the kaleidoscopic suns phenomenon. That's my hypothesis, right?
Yeah.
But it's interesting, though, that in all of these different stories that I found involving these solar orbs moving rapidly and that are associated with the sun and are colored and pretty much happen at dusk or dawn, they all seem to be in a religious, the narrative is always placed in a religious context. It's interpreted as having to do with the apocalypse or the sin and arrogance of the people there. And there was even one that I found in the airship files that was a little bit different from the other ones that I found because it was more in a positive light. It wasn't like ominous, but again, it had this mention of in relation to a different celestial marvel that happened at the same time in the same place. They also talked about these orbs associated with the sun.
And I just posted a case, 1790, the Alencon, Normandy, France case, that was likely a hoax. And it does share some similarities with, again, that Canary Island case we talked about at the very beginning, because it's this bubble and kind of a guy inside the bubble, and he's kind of sitting on a stool. And that's at least what the illustration is, right? But the problem is that it's like, it didn't happen. Like, it supposedly was told in the papers by this one guy. And when they went and later like looked at all the records, like there's just no record this story ever happened or was reported like anywhere. And so it likely didn't even happen.
It was the guy in the bubble that made the report. He was just can't trust that guy in the bubble.
It was supposedly told by a police inspector and was sent into the French Academy of Sciences, but the Academy reported in 2006 that they have no knowledge of such report. They've looked, they can't find any report they've ever received about this event. And this is another one that Vallée has in his book that he talks about, and is in a couple other things. And people say that maybe it was a UFO crash or maybe it was a time traveler, but yeah, again, likely never actually happened. So that's the problem with a lot of these old cases, is that they may not be real events. Like, they may just be, meant to, kind of teach a lesson or portray a message or an idea. Or they, there's a lot of reasons why these stories appear, and they may not all be factual events that really happened.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. What's going on here? Sorry, hold on a second. There we go. That's what I wanted. Okay. And for a final story, a secretary bird chick was born in a safari park in England. On Friday, BBC reported that a couple of mating secretary birds living in captivity at the Longleat Safari Park hatched their second chick. The chick was reportedly hatched about 2 weeks ago, and its sex is yet to be determined. The Longleat Safari Park is on the Longleat Estate in Wiltshire, England. The secretary bird, Sagittarius serpentarius, is native to savannas and grasslands across sub-Saharan Africa, and is listed as endangered on the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. They are the tallest bird of prey in the world and have a wingspan of 7 feet with a distinctive head crest. They're known for stomping small prey with their long legs. Before we go, if you enjoy, before Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy and intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description, or which I will actually put in the episode description after the episode is over. One moment, please. Technical difficulties. Everyone have fun with each other or themselves.
My next case, guys, the Valençol, France case, July 1st, 1965. So I'll be posting that tonight, and that'll be next week. So
Ooh, Valençol, awesome.
yeah, I think I have 2 or 3 copies of that comic too. I've got duplicates. And it's not the only comic version of the case I have, so I should have a lot of cool illustrations.
All right, continuing. Here at Ufos, our political and personal views are not the same, and the work of each of us is independent work. Personal views or positions expressed in individual pieces are not those of Ufos, who is not a person and has no views, or the other hosts. Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at The Earth YouTube channel. Visit Luis Cayetano's website, ufologyiscorrupt.com, or you will die. And you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, and he only makes a teeny tiny, itsy bitsy, little tiny bit of money off it. Please consider visiting his Patreon page and becoming his patron. Please do this. Really, please. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Simon Fly. Thank you, Puxley. Thank you, The Gods. Thank you, Vancouver guy. Jeff's
That guy's a
alternate.
weirdo. What's up with that Vancouver guy, dude?
And also thank you so much to all of the doggies. Thank you to Dorothy. Thank you to Luis's anonymous doggies. What are your dogs' names, Luis? Can I ask you that?
That's classified.
You can't box the dogs live on air.
I'll just ask. Jeremy Corbell. I'm sure he'll have good answers for me. I'll ask Richard Doty. He'll give me like a list of 25 names.
Doty. All right.
All right. And in the words of... Oh, shoot. In the words of the disc, here come the men in black. They're just trying to get our attention.